Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. I think we'll get started. There's probably still some people joining in, but we'll get a start here. Feel free to say hello in the chat. You can drop us a message there. Let us know where you're from. And also, you can ask any questions while throughout the course of the presentation, and we'll address those at the end. So we're here today as part of the Truth and Reconciliation from Within week. And the theme this year is the partition of nations. And in particular, we're going to discuss today the partition of India from a cosmological perspective. So this might be a slightly new way of looking at this issue than you've encountered before. I'm going to do my best to really just cover the basics. And we can ask questions at the end and go into more depth about anything that is of interest to you. So, yeah, without any further ado, let's jump in. My name is Adi TURIYA. I am the current director of the Aeon Center of Cosmology. We're located in Tamil Nadu in the Palani Hills of South India. And the center was founded in 1986 by Patrizia Norelli Bachelet, also known as Thea. So our work is held within the lineage of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. Thea was a disciple of the Mother living in Pondicherry in the 1970s, and she later shifted to Kodaikanal in the region where we are now, where she established her Aeon Center of Cosmology. As for myself, Sri Aurobindo actually came to me when I was quite young and set me on the path of his integral yoga. All this took place internally. Obviously, he and the Mother had left the earth by that point, but it completely changed the course of my life, and it brought me into contact with Thea and her work. And all three of them, Sri Aurobindo, the Mother, Thea, were all deeply concerned about India and her role in this transition that the earth is currently going through. So they all commented, on the need for India's unity. And Thea in particular wrote several books on this subject. And this is primarily what I'm going to be drawing from. I'm just presenting, her ideas, her diagnosis of the partition and all the events that led up to it. So some of her books that cover this are Time and Imperishability, The Partition of India, and Kashmir. And she wrote about these themes cover, many of the things she wrote touch on these themes. But if I could summarize really briefly, just so you know what we're going to get into, I'm going to summarize her main thesis or her main view on this subject, which you could maybe, this is the subtitle of one of her books, but you could characterize it as a convergence of time, space, and destiny. So what does this mean?
Yeah, but should we respond to this?
No, if you could mute yourself, please. We'll have questions at the end. And yeah, if you want to ask questions, you can always drop them in the chat just by writing it, and we'll address those when we get through the rest of the presentation. So in essence, this means that the partition that took place in 1947 was actually the end result of a very long process where India slowly drifted away from a certain cosmic alignment from which she actually draws her spiritual strength and protection. It's the basis of Indian civilization, and there was this long, slow drift away from that alignment that ultimately led to partition. So this is something that came from within India itself, and it's there that we're going to find the cause, the underlying cause, as well as the solution to this problem. So some of Thea's key points on this topic are, first of all, that Vedic cosmology was tropical, which means it was anchored to the earth. It was anchored to the solstices and the equinoxes that support the alignment of the what in the Vedas figured as a journey of a year. So this was anchored to these solstices and equinoxes, or the ayanas and vishuvas, as they're called in India. However, as it's fairly well known, for about 1500 years, India has actually followed the Nirayana system. So this anchors us to the distant stars rather than to the Earth. So this is one of the key shifts that took place that ultimately led to the partition. Now, because these stars gradually shift relative to the Earth's solstices and equinoxes, this caused a gradual drift away from India's original purpose and the original alignment. And this, in turn, led to a slow erosion of her spiritual power, which ultimately allowed other forces to come in. This is basically, how Thea viewed the underlying causes of the partition. So according to Thea, the Nirayana system ultimately we can identify as the cause of the partition of India. But this was inseparable from something that took place more on the spiritual level, which was an otherworldly turn that took place in the post-Vedic period. And you could even say that the Nirayana system is really just an external symbol of this turn away from the earth. And it has served to materialize the effects of this otherworldly post-Vedic orientation in India. So the theme of this event is truth and reconciliation from within. So we're going to have to look at what does that reconciliation look like? What does it consist of? This is a map of partitioned India, or the division that took place at the time of partition, which, as we know, was an extremely violent and traumatic event. But if we focus our attention there on the actual events, we'll never arrive at the underlying cause, which in turn can point us towards the deeper purpose and the solution and even the opportunity that this presents for India and for the Earth. So I'm going to try to walk through these causal factors, and build it up from the basics in a way that everyone can follow, I hope. And I will again take questions at the end. So you can drop them in the chat at any point in time, but we'll address those at the end. So briefly, I'm going to structure this basically into 4 sections. We'll look at first the cosmic foundations of the Veda and Vedic civilization as Thea taught it. And then we'll look at India's central role in this current global transformation that's underway. And we'll outline as briefly as we can the nature of the divide that I just outlined between, that took place, this otherworldly turn, and at the same time, the shift in the way of reckoning sacred time. And finally, we'll look at what reconciliation looks like, taking all of that into account. So we have a lot to cover, and I'll try to move through it smoothly, and then we'll address your questions towards the end. And so, yeah, we're going to start right at the very beginning. And the most important thing to understand about Vedic culture is that it was earth-centered. And this is the symbol of the earth. And the 4 cardinal directions served as anchors or pillars that anchor the earth permanently in its alignment to the cosmos. So this circle is one of the main Vedic symbols. Sometimes it's described as a wheel. It's always described as a single wheel when it is. And this represents the ecliptic, the circle of the ecliptic. And these cardinal points really anchor the whole framework of symbolism that's embedded in the Veda. So this ecliptic is basically the circle that the Earth, the sun, the moon, the planets, all of them move around this circle. And these four cardinal directions were the key anchors for the Vedic system of symbolism that they used to communicate their worldview, their process. It's actually a transformative process that they symbolized through the year. And these four cardinal directions, while these are, spatial directions like you see on a map, they're actually based on the cycle of the day. So as we all experience every day, the sun rises in the east, culminates at its most elevated position above the horizon, sets, goes below the horizon. This is very basic stuff. It's the very, basic facts of our everyday experience, but this was the first layer of symbolism that is used in the Veda to describe this inner journey of transformation. And the next layer of that symbolism, what really kind of brings it into its fuller shape, is the equivalence of this daily cycle with the yearly cycle. So at the same time as the sun appears to go around the Earth. It's due to the Earth's rotation, obviously, but every day it goes through its cycle. And at the same time, from day to day throughout the year, the sun slowly shifts in the other direction. So it shifts towards the south, and only slowly over the first half of the year will come towards the autumn equinox, and finally culminates at the northern point, or the winter solstice, the December solstice. And this double motion was the basis for the Vedic symbol of the journey of the year. And it's entirely anchored by the solstices and the equinoxes and their correspondence with sunrise, sunset, the four phases of the day, the four cardinal directions. All of these were superimposed and combined in the Vedic symbolism that we find in the earliest scriptures and the earliest process that underlies Indian civilization. And yeah, just to kind of reinforce, it's important to note that this equivalence only holds when we observe the tropical year, or anchor ourselves to the solstices and equinoxes, which is exactly what we find in the Rig Veda and other ancient teachings. So to complete this initial picture, we also have to look at how the year was divided, obviously not just into four, but into 12 equal parts. And this 12-fold division of the year formed the full language of this journey that the Vedic rishis used to describe the process of transformation. So here's just one verse. It's by Dirka Tamas, who composed this verse in the Rig Veda. It's fairly well known. It goes, "One wheel with 12 spokes and 3 hubs. Who hath perceived it? In it are as if fixed 360 pegs that shake not in the least." The key points here, obviously, is that it's one wheel, chakra mekam, and this is divided into 12 sections. And while the wheel itself doesn't move, there's these 3 hubs. So there's a daily rotation, there's a yearly rotation, there's a precession of the equinoxes even, but those 4 pillars, the solstices, the equinoxes, are perfectly stable. And this formed, the basis of how they articulated this symbolic language that we find in the Veda of a journey of a year. So just to summarize, I know that's in a way I'm giving you a crash course here on Thea's view of Vedic symbolism. It connects also with Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the Veda. But to summarize the main points, we have these two motions of the sun and the earth that produce a daily cycle and a yearly cycle, and these move, in opposite directions around this one wheel. Whereas the daily motion culminates directly at midday. This yearly journey consisted first of a plunge into the symbolic darkness of midnight and only slowly emerging over the western horizon, the Sharada Vishuva, so the autumn equinox, and finally culminating in the 10th month at Uttarayana, or the winter solstice. And so I've numbered the months and also given the zodiacal signs. And I don't have time to go through all of the layers of symbolism here, but I do want to highlight that one of the most common depictions of Agni, who is one of the principal Vedic deities and represents, among other things, the head of the year, the opening of the year at the vernal equinox, is that he is depicted often with two faces. So one facing in either direction, reinforcing this double motion and this double symbolism of the day and the year. And this is basically an example of how this zodiacal knowledge was encoded in the Vedas and the Puranas. We also see here that Agni's Vahana is the ram, which is Aries or Mesha. So Agni was associated always with the beginning of the year. He's also always the first deity in each of the Rig Veda books. It's always opening with Agni. So it was Agni at the opening of the year in the first month. And while we don't have time to go through the entire sequence, the important thing as it relates to India and the unity of India and the purpose of India and the partition of India, it is the all-important passage through the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th months. And this is really the critical part of the Vedic journey. Again, the Veda uses the year as a symbol of the soul's journey, and this culminated in these 8th, 9th, and 10th months. The 8th month in particular represented a confrontation with death, or the mortal condition of the human race, and that's symbolized by Martanda, the 8th son of Aditi. But importantly, the journey doesn't stop there. It doesn't end at the 8th stage. There's further experiences to be had beyond that confrontation with our mortality. It continues on into the 9th month. And in the Veda, there's what's referred to as the Navagvas. Nava means 9. So it's the rishis who prolonged the sacrifice through 9 months are said to have gone beyond this consciousness of mortality. But in the 9th month, this is still an experience in essence, it was experienced as the consciousness of that which is immortal, but it wasn't brought into the full manifestation at that stage of the journey. This is that full manifestation is actually the function of the 10th month. And this is what connects us to the purpose of India and the unity of India, which Thea saw as extremely connected to this passage from the 9th into the 10th month, which in the Veda everywhere is the month of victory, the month of emergence into this culmination of the soul's journey and the gateway to a higher possibility or a higher poise of consciousness than the mortal human consciousness. And that's where I wanted to land in this section. The most important thing I think to bear in mind is that this symbolism of the culminating phase of this Vedic journey again, it only holds when the Uttarayana is on the solstice itself. That's when the axial alignment of the Earth with the cardinal north point is in place. And that's what makes it real. That's what unlocks the energies. As it's said also in the Veda, the months and the years are what open these worlds to our experience. And as we'll see, this is also very deeply connected to India, in particular, this 10th month and her unique Dharma. So let's go into that then. Moving on. One thing to note is that Thea, as well as Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, considered India to occupy a very central position in the changes that the world is currently going through. And in Thea's view, this centrality was connected to its identity with Makar or Capricorn, that this month that symbolizes the Vedic victory or this divine manifestation upon Earth. It wasn't in any way an otherworldly liberation or escape from the Earth. It was actually a descent of unity consciousness into the material dimension, this 10th month. So India, exactly like Capricorn, represents for the whole Earth a gateway to a higher destiny. This is India's offering, you could say, to the Earth, is this possibility of a higher type of existence. And that comes from India's link with the Vedic age and the fact that that golden thread is still alive. As we'll see, it's been covered with many layers of veils, but it still is the root and the core of Indian civilization. And yeah, it's what sets India apart and what makes it possible for India to bring this gateway, a new creation to the rest of the earth. And just dwelling for a moment on this Capricorn symbol and its relation to India, obviously the most apparent thing is how well it maps directly onto the landmass of India. But the symbolism of Capricorn itself, aside from being the month of the Vedic victory, is that it bridges and unifies and joins the highest heights and the deepest depths. This is often symbolized by the mountaintop and the depths of the ocean. And the Indian landmass itself actually materially does that. We have the highest peaks on Earth in the north, in the Himalayas, and then all of the landscapes running all through the subcontinent, culminating in the deep south in the depths of the ocean. So that same symbol of Capricorn is actually embodied in India herself. And another way we can reinforce this association between India and Makar or Capricorn is preserved in the Puranas through the imagery associated with Ganga, the goddess Ganga. So obviously this is one of the most sacred rivers in India, and she travels across the body of India. And in the Puranas, she's associated with the Vahana, or the vehicle, the carrier of Capricorn or Makar, often figured as a crocodile, as in this painting. So this preserves the knowledge of the association of Capricorn and India. And it's important to note, or just to reinforce, that this Capricorn is not a constellation up in the stars. This Capricorn is actually the land that is India herself. Okay, so Thea, in a way, brought heaven down to earth and showed how the Indian landmass itself fulfills this function of the 10th month, this gateway to a higher destiny. And another way that we can show this is using, she often used this graphic of the map of the Earth. She called it the geocosmic map of the Earth. But it's simply the modern um, map that we all know, anchored at the Greenwich mean. And when you follow the path of the sun around the longitudes of the Earth, when you arrive at Capricorn, you also arrive at India. And likewise, going around the latitudes from north to south and coming up in the 10th section of that circle, you arrive at Capricorn, which again is India. So in both directions or in all directions, there's this convergence on India and its identity with Makar, with this 10th month of victory that is really the culmination of the Vedic journey. So there's, yeah, another way to just see clearly the identity that India has as Makar. So next, we're just going to zoom in on this portion of the map here and take a look at the Indian landmass itself in its undivided form as it has existed for thousands of years. And what's remarkable here is that it's exactly 30 degrees. So that map I just showed is divided into 30-degree sections because that's, the 12 equal sections of the circle. And it's exactly 30 degrees from the western edge of Balochistan and its border with Iran to the mouths of the Ganga Sagara, or where the Ganga enters into the ocean. So that 30 degrees is Capricorn proper, let's say. And then there's this additional 10 degrees that encompasses Burma primarily, which used to be known as Brahmadesha, the land of Brahma. And this kind of completes the energy flow that is Akan Bharat and sweeps back around, completing the circuit and creating the full landmass. So this is Akan Bharat, or undivided India before partition. And again, we've overlaid, as they often did, the Capricorn glyph on the landmass to show or emphasize the identity of India and Capricorn. And I guess, note one more thing here is the central line. So in the exact midpoint between the 61st and 91st meridians, there would be the 76th. And this passes directly through what is traditionally the meridian of India, which is in Ujjain. And it also passes through in the north, Amarnath, which is in Kashmir. And this highlights the central position, Kashmir being both at the crown of India, but also along this central line, explains partly why it's such a sensitive area, and also why, things that happen in Kashmir reflect throughout the rest of India because of that central position and also that northernmost position. And aside from delineating the landmass itself, this Capricorn glyph delineates a threefold energy flow that flows through the land. And specifically, that's the three gunas of Rajas, Sattva, Tamas, or creation, preservation, and dissolution. In these various parts of India, we encounter in various ways this threefold energy. And for India to fulfill this role as a gateway to a higher destiny for the earth, this threefold energy is needed. Like, this is part of the reason the unity of India was so important, for example, to Sri Aurobindo. Also, the mother and Thea considered this critical for India to fulfill her full potential, was to have access to this full threefold energy flow. So in the far west, we have the creative and rajasic energies. This was both, as far as we know, the birthplace of Vedic culture, but it's also, now that it's been broken off or separated from the threefold flow, um, prone to more violence and strife and impulsive energies. And then as we move eastwards towards the center, this is where, especially in the deep south, is where the traditions are most well preserved because they've been, among other things, least subject to destruction and violence that swept across the whole north of India. But this quality of balance, harmony, preservation is present in the centermost part. And then as we go further and further east, there's this dissipation of the energies. It's where the Vedic culture diffused into the rest of Asia, for example, all the way to Indonesia, as far north as Japan. This energy of dissolution, which also serves to always make the way for a new creation. So India needs all three if she's going to regenerate and renew her essential purpose. Otherwise, with partition, these two dynamic energies were cut off. And all that India is left with is this static peace and this, on one hand, the traditions are preserved, but on the other hand, they're deprived of this, the power of creative adaptation and self-renewal. So this is part of the damage that was done, you could say, on the spiritual level through partition, is India no longer has this full threefold play of the gunas within the national soul, let's say. So let's look at how this came to pass in the first place. Because on one level, I mean, if India is Capricorn, if it's the land of the eternal victory, if India is the Bharata Shakti, how on earth was this ever divided into parts? It seems almost inconceivable that this could happen. In fact, Thea referred to this once as dividing the indivisible. But this actually took place. It did take quite a long period of time. It played out over thousands of years. And upon India's independence from the British, this great divide materialized as the partition. But if we're going to find the cause of this division, we have to go back into the slow process that took place that divided the indivisible. So let's take a look at how this happened. First, going back and just to recap, in the Vedic age, which really extends further back than we even have a cultural memory of, to around 1000 BC, more or less. Throughout this period, the tropical zodiac was used as the symbol through this journey of the year for the process of transformation. So this is what we explored briefly in the first part. And the solstices and equinoxes were completely central to that symbol of the journey of the year holding together. They're the very basis of the equivalence of the day and the year. And we should note that the nakshatras, or the constellations, in this period were simply aids to observation. They were selected based on their alignment with the solstices and equinoxes. In fact, in the various layers of Vedic and Brahmanic literature, we see that the ancients changed which stars that they associated with the beginning of the year based on which one was at the vernal equinox during that period of time. So what was important to them was that the year began on or about March 21st, or what we nowadays call March 21st, but it's that vernal equinox, that day when the day and the night are equal. that they considered was equivalent to dawn and was therefore the beginning of the year. So whatever star was aligned with that equinox was in the Vedic ages used as the reference star, which they based, the rest of their observations upon. The other key point about the Vedic age is there was no real separation between spirituality and the secular world. They were seen as the same thing. You could say Vedic culture was both more spiritual and more secular than our own because there was no division between the material world, which was seen as itself a divine manifestation imbued with a divine purpose. And that is where the first division took place. There was the departure from that sense of a unity of the spiritual and the material. And we can ask ourselves, how did that even happen? So in the post-Vedic age, so after 1000 BC, there developed this ideal of liberation. It becomes more and more important. And without pointing a finger at anyone, we can say that with the advent of Buddhism and other movements that occurred around the time, there was this decisive shift away from the Vedic ideal of a divine life upon earth. In fact, Buddhism itself was a kind of reaction against the ritualism that had set in around the Vedas and the Brahmanic religion of the time. Because by that time, the true Vedic knowledge had started to recede, and it was being replaced by rituals that were starting to even lose their meaning. And seeing this, Buddha wanted to restore an authentic spirituality based on actual spiritual solutions to the problems of humanity. And this in itself, you could say, is all well and good. But at the same time, the poise that was adopted was completely un-Vedic. He saw the earth as a field of suffering, and his solution was actually to dissolve our attachments and the need to be reborn at all. In other words, to escape from the earth. And whereas in the Vedic times, there was this sense of completing that journey through to the 10th month and realizing immortality in life upon the earth. By Buddha's time, there's this idea of exhausting your karmas and avoiding the creation of any new karmas and thereby avoiding birth on earth at all. Sri Aurobindo referred to this as the ruse of the supreme. In other words, it did serve a divine purpose. It was an action of the supreme, or even you could say an intervention of the supreme, but it served it negatively through a negation of the Vedic truth and the Vedic way of life that was really the root of Indian civilization. So the change that took place here is that instead of all the lines converging on the earth as they do in the tropical zodiac with those pillars of the solstices and equinoxes converging all lines to a center, which is the soul, which is the earth, almost the very opposite orientation was adopted, where all the lines now diverge away from the earth and are dissolved into the beyond. So while on one hand, this provoked a kind of resurgence of Vedic and Brahmanic culture, this itself now even bore this stamp of otherworldliness and liberation. So even within Hinduism, we have to call it at this point a post-Vedic culture, and it took a new direction from this point onward. In other words, as they often put it, the original Vedic knowledge was forced underground. That is to say, it was preserved, the knowledge was preserved in myth, in temple culture, in the Puranas, in the Vedas themselves, which are extremely well preserved and there to this day in their ancient form. But despite that, the living knowledge was replaced by this quest for liberation, and it was directed away from the earth. So, all that said, we're now coming basically to the crux of the whole matter, the actual cause of the partition, as at least as Thea identified it, and that is the birth of the Nirayana system. And the name itself is actually rather telling because Nirayana means without the solstice or ignoring the solstice or disregarding the solstice. It's a turn away from the earth, and its function was to anchor consciousness away from the earth on a distant star, as if our salvation could somehow be found out there hundreds of light years away from the earth. And it's important to keep in mind that the Nirayana system is not actually very ancient. For instance, throughout the Puranic age, the tropical zodiac continued to be the primary frame of reference. The solstices and the equinoxes were the symbolic alignment, the periods of alignment that defined the phases of the ritual year. And also throughout this period, the nakshatras were still used as markers or aids for observation, but they did not form a fixed or unchanging system. In fact, during the Puranic age itself, they shifted the head nakshatra from Kritika, or the Pleiades, as it used to be in ancient times, to Ashwini, which even to this day is considered the first nakshatra. And that was correct at that time. It also demonstrates at that time that they were continuing to adjust their reference stars to correspond with the tropical zodiac. So the sages continued to follow the earth. They continued to follow the solstices and equinoxes. But the texts of this period, we're talking, the early centuries of the Common Era, the Puranas, the Siddhantas in particular, became more and more fixed in their form and turned into authoritative references for this body of ancient knowledge. So future generations inherited these teachings and tended to treat them with much reverence as kind of fixed truths that hold for all time without realizing that in order to remain applicable, they need to be continuously updated, at least as it relates to this matter of the solstice. Instead, what happened, especially after figures like Varahamihira and Aryabhata, who were really, cultural giants, they synthesized a vast amount of knowledge and preserved them in very seminal texts that we still have to this day. But even they themselves didn't follow a Nirayana system. They were just describing, the stars as they existed at that time. And they, at least in their minds, were still following a tropical system where the solstices and equinoxes were the symbolic anchor of the year. So in a sense, nobody even created the Nirayana system. It has no sanction in any of the scriptures or any of these classical texts. It simply is that the tradition became fossilized at this point. So it assumed a fixed form that was completely relevant in the year 500, but began to lose its relevance as the centuries wore on. So what's the result of this fossilization that took place? First of all, I think it's apparent, even to this day, Hindu culture remains fixated on the nakshatra system as they stood at that time around the year 500. all of the Ayanamsha systems, all of the Nirayana calendars are anchored to a moment in time that happened 1500 years ago. And because the stars are constantly shifting relative to the solstices and equinoxes, this resulted in ever widening gaps in both time and space in the body of India through which external forces were allowed to enter. And in a sense, it's actually immaterial what forces those were, what armies came in. The fact is, these gaps were allowed to form and hostile forces were allowed to enter. And this is what began to set the stage for what would ultimately partition the nation centuries later. In fact, from around 700 onwards, India underwent repeated invasions by foreign powers, and this only continued to increase in severity, all while these gaps were growing bigger and bigger and bigger because of the fixation on an unmoving frame of reference that was losing its applicability to the current times. And this simply continued over the centuries, culminating, as we know, in the British Raj. So, in Thea's view, all of this whole progression of events, was only possible because of two things. One, India abandoned the earth-centered Vedic quest or the Vedic journey for a divine life upon earth. Instead, it turned its gaze away and beyond the earth towards escape from having to be born on the earth ever again, even. And following this, the second factor was an abandonment of the Vedic tropical year, which for thousands of years had provided the means for the whole of society to unite its energies. Every member of society was encompassed in this Vedic symbol of the journey of the year, and this allowed the nation's energies, even with the vast multiplicity and diversity of India, to unify and unite these energies around the core of a divine purpose on earth. And at risk of repeating myself, I'll just emphasize once again that system of alignment of the nation's energies completely depends on the alignment of the solstice and the equinox and its equivalence with this symbol of the day and the culmination of the sun. This is the whole basis of the Indian and the Vedic cultural inspiration, let's say. At any rate, so the British Raj established itself, and after nearly a century of it, India did finally attain independence. But it did not attain unity, as Sri Aurobindo commented at the time. In fact, independence and partition occurred virtually in the same moment. It was practically the same event, almost as if by affirming its independence, India materialized this accumulated drift that had built up over the centuries, which by 1947 amounted to about 23 degrees. That means the stars of Aryabhata's time and Varahamihira's time had drifted over the centuries by a full 23 degrees. And this is still what most temples are following, is this calendar that was applicable 1500 years ago. So this 23 degrees, interestingly enough, manifested in very interesting ways in the partition process. For example, the Pakistan border begins, I'll show you a graphic in a second, but it begins 23 degrees west of the mouths of the Ganga, which in the second section, we looked at how that corresponds to Capricorn. So this 23 degrees west is 23 degrees Capricorn. It's also 23 degrees north of the equator. And at the same time, nearly 23% of Indian territory was, so to say, lost in the process of partition. So that rupture in time translated itself at the moment of partition into a rupture in space. So this just depicts the figures that I was just talking about. So from the mouths of the Ganga or Ganga Sagar, there's this 23-degree drift, which is the exact measure of drift in time that had occurred since the system became frozen 1,500 years ago. And also 23 degrees north, that's where the border with Pakistan actually begins. So it created like a fracture line, you could say. And the other sensitive point was exactly at the mouths of the Ganga, which was partitioned into East Pakistan at first and then Bangladesh. And again, these green portions of the map is what was cut out, and that is effectively 23% of the land area. So these correspondences makes the causal link between Nirayana and the partition virtually unmistakable. You can, of course, brush it aside as coincidence, but this is a very direct causal relationship in Thea's view. Because in effect, what happened, at the time of independence is India actually restored the convergence of space and time that is the very basis of the civilization. It's just that because of this accumulated dislocation of the energies from the Uttarayana or the December solstice, that resulted in this fragmentation at these sensitive points. So that being the case, what exactly is it that needs to be reconciled? What can we heal? What can heal this great divide, given that it's thousands of years in the making, at least 2,000 years, and the fact that partition has already taken place? In Thea's view, there's actually really only one solution, which is to reconcile Makar Sankranti with the December solstice. Everything else, she said, would fall into place if we just do that. That is to say, since India in her higher destiny is this gateway for the earth as a whole to a more divine existence upon the earth, as the Veda portrayed in this journey and its culmination. That means that in some way, India needs to realize and embody this culmination of the Vedic journey that's symbolized by this attainment at the December solstice. And this aligns very much with Sri Aurobindo's message of a divine life upon earth, which at the same time is the essence of Capricorn, or that 10th month of victory. But this actually involves a complete reversal of direction, of that otherworldly quest for liberation, back towards an earth-centered Vedic quest. Sorry. And essentially a divine return to earth, a turning back of the otherworldly energies that has really just siphoned off India's finest energies away from the earth. And this is largely what Sri Aurobindo came to do. They often said Sri Aurobindo came to reverse the direction. In other words, to turn the spiritual quest back towards the earth. And inevitably, at the same time, this means a return to the Vedic year of the Sayana or solstice-based symbolic system. And So that's Thea's basic diagnosis, but she wasn't alone in this perception. In fact, we can look to the calendar reform committee that Nehru convened shortly after independence. And among their conclusions, having studied this problem very deeply, in fact, at that time there were still dozens of different Nirayana calendars, each one based on a different calculation, based on a different star to find where the start of the year might be, as if there was any confusion in the matter. Their main finding was that in continuing to follow the Nirayana system, and that means really all Nirayana systems, the Hindu calendar makers are under the delusion that they are following the path of Dharma. They're actually committing the whole Hindu society to adharma, which means the opposite of Dharma. And at the same time, this committee did not have the courage or the means at their disposal, at any rate, to go against the accumulated weight of a 1,500-year-old tradition. So in the same report, they said that their actual recommendation, which was a Nirayana calendar, is to be regarded only as a measure of compromise so that we avoid a violent break with the established custom. But the choice of words here is kind of ironic because if this diagnosis is correct, it had already caused an extremely violent break. Okay, the partition of India was possibly the bloodiest moment of our entire history. And the fact that this disconnection or this dislocation of India's finest energies from the cosmic alignment that is the basis of her civilization resulted in this partition, it's already caused an extremely violent break. So it's interesting that they weren't willing to take that further step to correct the mismeasure and the misalignment of India's spiritual energies. So we're getting near the end, and I just want to ask ourselves, I mean, we could certainly ask what difference can changing the calendar actually make, especially in light of the fact that partition has actually already occurred. How is changing the calendar going to make any difference at all? You know, even if all of this is true, even if the Veda was Sayana, you know, even if this otherworldly influence siphoned away India's energies, like what is changing the calendar actually going to do? And what we need to recall here is really what is at stake and what actually has been lost. And to frame this question, we can remember that Vedic civilization, part of what the rishis set in place was a culture that encompassed the whole of society in this process. Whatever your walk of life, there was a cultural container for this process that culminated actually in a divine manifestation upon earth. So this culmination of the journey, this divine purpose that's able to give meaning to every member of society is in the Veda, it's symbolized by that 10th month, and it is identified with India. So India is the destined land where this can occur. And again, that symbol only has meaning when it's anchored to the solstice, because otherwise there is no cosmic alignment of energies. In other words, this whole process revolved around the establishment of a cosmic alignment and a convergence of all lines upon a point. That point was the earth. It was nowhere outside of the earth. It wasn't out in the heavens. It was the soul of each individual living upon the earth. That was the focus of the Vedic path. And it had as its goal a transformation of the earth consciousness, not a departure away from the earth. So in a sense, it's not the calendar itself that would bring any change. Rather, it's a restoration of this alignment that can unlock spiritual power of India and unify her fragmented body. This would inevitably involve a return to the Sayana system, but the key movement is really this restoration of the alignment and the Vedic vision that sees the earth as the field of a divine fulfillment and extends this possibility of a divine life upon earth to the whole of humanity. This is the potential that India holds and is still waiting to be unlocked and realized and set into motion. So this concludes the main part of the presentation. I do invite you all to join us tomorrow for an interview with Nilima Bhatt, and we'll explore this topic in more depth. You can also reach out on our website. You can contact us there in case you're interested in we're preparing an introduction to applied cosmology to go deeper into these topics for anyone who's interested. So you can express your interest there. And with that, let's look at some questions. We do have some time left. Yeah, so I'm just pulling up the questions. Okay, first question. So here, I'll switch the view here. First question, the 360 pegs, which we quoted from the Rig Veda, does that represent a year? But 365 days in a year, where are the 5 days? That's an excellent question. This was addressed in different ways in many of these ancient cultures. For example, Egypt also followed a 360-day calendar. And those 5 days were considered essentially outside of the calendar, or it's also called intercalary. In other words, in between the calendar days, you would add extra days. So the understanding is that there were essentially 12 months of 30 days, and then 5 days, sometimes 6 days outside the calendar to bring the 0 point back to the vernal equinox. I hope that basically answers the question. You can drop in the chat if you want any more details on that. Next question. How and in what ways is India and her wholeness so significant for the world? That's also a great thing to explore. The fact is that, India's ancient knowledge and her ancient culture weren't entirely unique to India alone. In other words, in the ancient distant past, this was actually more of a widespread culture. It may have even been a global culture of whether we call it Vedic or something else. There was this cosmic tradition and this understanding of the divine purpose of life on Earth. But it's India that has preserved this living link with that past. And through, the Vedas, through the Upanishads, through the Puranas, there's this thread or this river that runs through all of it and reaches us even to this day. And it's that India has uniquely amongst the nations of this earth. Other nations have developed other things. India didn't develop modern science, for example. That was the destiny of Europe and the Western nations. India had this other destiny to preserve this link with the deep knowledge of this divine purpose embedded in the heart of the earth. And again, it's been veiled and covered and even dismembered through partition, but it still is a living, it's still alive and can be brought back into the play of the world nations. And actually, I mean, Sri Aurobindo and the mother considered this crucial to the future of the earth. Like if India didn't do that, if India somehow fails in recovering her purpose, we'll virtually have to start from scratch. You know, this link, if it's lost, it will be almost, devastating in a way. And I hope that communicates at least how I'm seeing and how Thea communicated to us, like how centrally important it is for India to bring forth her Dharma. Let's see. Another question, or maybe it's just a comment. 23 also relates to 23 days late celebration of Makar Sankranti. Pongal Makar Sankranti celebrated on 15 January. Yes, precisely. That 23 degrees is essentially those 23 days. So every day of the year represents 1 degree of the circle. And so after that slip, I mean, these days it's more like 24 degrees. Soon it'll be 25 degrees. It continues to drift. So, and that was, Thea really emphasized the importance of the Makar Sankranti, because if you set that right, I mean, all of the other festivals will be automatically set right too. But the Capricorn Gateway, because of how intimately linked it is with India's nature and her Dharma and her essence, is the main one that needs to be brought back into that alignment. So I'm just scrolling through if there's any other questions. Not seeing any right now.
Yeah, go to the main.
Go to the main.
13 months in
Oh, I'm in
the
there.
calendar. How does
But
that
there are
work?
13 months in the Vedic calendar that we follow today. So even in the distant past, the Vedic system was solely lunar. So it was both solar and lunar. And there's either 12 or 13 months. Not every year has 13 lunar months. But essentially, as I tried to outline in the first section, that circle divided into 12 formed the framework or the yeah, the framework or the reference points for the movements of all the other celestial bodies, including the sun and the moon, which gives us that lunar calendar. So, I mean, even today, when there's 13 moons in a year, one of them, there's going to be a month with two new moons. One of those 30-degree sections of the year will have two new moons. And that happens not every year. It depends on the alignment of the new moon with these equinoxes and solstices. And this one has a follow-up question. Given the situation we are in, what is the way forward to establish Dharma in your own life? The thing that they emphasized a lot was to really look at this question of otherworldliness that has become extremely pervasive in not just Indian culture, but spiritual culture around the world. This use of spiritual ideas and practices to essentially escape or withdraw from participation and involvement and embodiment in the earth. And that can be a really tricky one to overcome because of how deeply rooted it has become in the traditions. So on an individual level, I think that's a really key point. And it was the one that Sri Aurobindo also really emphasized. It's that mukti is important. Like you have to overcome your desires, the restlessness of your mind. But the purpose of the yoga is not to dissolve your consciousness or withdraw entirely from the earth, you know. So I would just answer this question by saying that we can adopt a life affirmative, earth centered view of the possibilities of spirituality on the earth. How can we remember the ways of the earth? Well, certainly these four directions. So the four cardinal directions, observing the solstices and the equinoxes as these moments of cosmic alignment, which was the basis of this Vedic journey. And I'm sure there's many other ways too. I'm just trying to draw from the material we just covered. But certainly by going deep within and finding there the divine presence and learning to see that divine presence everywhere in life around you, you know, and not seeking to look outside to you know have to transcend the bodily experience to find this divine presence, to really look for it within the heart of life, within the material dimension, because that was the original view of things, is that everything, all of creation, is this miracle of the divine unfolding itself. So again, thank you all very much for joining today. It was a pleasure to present all this to you. We do have a few moments, and I'm seeing one more question pop in. Do you feel that the partition of Pakistan as a nation state, distinct from that nation state of India, is the main or only partition-related problem that needs healing? Or do you also view as a spiritual and type of problem the other widespread partition of India into 28 mostly ethno-linguistic states and 8 union territories? Okay, I mean, that's an interesting question, and it's because this partition or this breaking apart has many dimensions to it. But the fact is, India has always been a multiplicity. Like the natural polity of India is very regional. It's very local based governance. And there's very few moments in Indian history where there was something like a central government. So I don't believe, I mean, although the partitioning of the states was perhaps slightly artificial, I don't think that in itself creates disunity among India. Certainly, the adoption of the British governance system is unnatural, and I think India will need to rediscover something that's more in line with its nature, this diversity, this vast diversity that India embodies. And Pakistan, Bangladesh, you know, these other nation states, it's not necessarily that they have to rejoin with the state of India as it exists today. I often have this sense that there will develop more of a regional kind of confederation. It might include places like Nepal and Bhutan, which didn't go through this violent process, but are still holding themselves kind of separate, you know. I know the mother felt that these states like Pakistan were quite artificial, and there was nothing really on a spiritual level binding it together, and that likely it would break apart into its constituent, you know, cultures. Balochistan is probably the trying to affirm itself the strongest right now. It's an example of maybe the disaggregation of Pakistan. And maybe at that point, there's a reunification in a different form. It might not be, you know, the central government of India necessarily. So I hope that touches on your question there. We're at time, but there is one last question. Maybe I'll address this one. How Nirjana has affected or create cracks in our natural resources, women and children and society, and how do we rebuild? This is a really wonderful question, because part of this turn away from the earth is a turn away from the divine feminine. And, very somewhat ironically, India is one of the few places where the divine goddess is worshipped. And yet, is she really, if you look at the treatment of women, if you look at the treatment of the earth and what has been allowed to happen, this last millennium, or it's hard to even gauge the length of time. There's a real mismatch there, and by returning to this earth-centered perspective, in my mind at least, we're also returning to an honoring of the divine feminine, of the embodied divinity that women represent. And that extends obviously to the natural world as well, that embodied divinity of the earth. I love this question because that is really key, and it's a much more vivid way of entering into this question than the partition of India. So we are over time now, so I think we'll wrap up. I really appreciate everyone for joining today. I hope you got something out of it. We will be doing an interview tomorrow, and many blessings. Namaskar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adi. I look forward to interviewing you tomorrow. Feel free, friends, to drop your questions on social media. We'll track it, or just show up and we will have time for Q&A. But this was absolutely mind-opening. Adi, I thank you on behalf of, thank you, and through you, Thea and Aeon Center of Cosmology, all the wonderful women who I know are on the call, who are behind this work, given a lifetime to this work. So you have opened something so huge for our first act of Truth and Reconciliation Work Week on Guru Purnima Day. And we are beholden, and may this hold the bar for the rest of the week to come. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Nilima.
See you tomorrow, everybody.